Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. Thank you for your patience and thank you for coming out on this very wet Vancouver day. So welcome to the final of this year's PuSh Assembly Critical Ideas panels on ethics and consent. My name is Peter Dickinson, and I am the director of Simon Fraser University's Institute for Performance Studies and a professor here in the School for the Contemporary Arts. I would first of all like to acknowledge that today's event takes place on the unceded Indigenous territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including lands belonging to the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. This acknowledgement, which settler citizens like myself have learned to incorporate into opening remarks at events such as these, does not begin to redress the historical violence of continued colonial occupation of these lands. However, as a performance studies scholar who believes that speech acts do things, that language is always consequential, I believe that the repetition of this acknowledgement and the complicated feelings it may incite among different individuals is performing important cultural work, if only in momentarily unsettling, taken for granted assumptions about our sense of place. Critical Ideas is a partnership between the PuSh Festival and the Institute for Performance Studies that brings together artists, critics, scholars, audiences to discuss formal, social, and ideological issues affecting performance practice and reception today. This is our fourth year partnering on this idea exchange, for which we also receive critical support from SFU's Woodward's Cultural Programs and SFU's Faculty of Communication, Art, and Technology. And for this particular panel, also I want to acknowledge the Banff Contemporary Center for Arts and Creativity, which has brought our moderator, Reneltta Arluk, to us today. At the core of any performance contract, whether between peers in a studio, a creator and a producer-presenter, a performer and her audience, there is a relationship, and one that is resolutely embodied. Recognizing this, how can we foster practices of ethical consent and care in performance and curation, while also acknowledging the power structures that necessarily govern every relationship between different bodies? To help navigate this thorny question, we have invited Reneltta Arluk, Director of Indigenous Arts at the Banff Center and a respondent at last year's Contemporary Indigenous Women's Performance Critical Ideas session, to moderate a discussion between an esteemed gathering of artists. So I'm now going to invite them to the stage, and Reneltta, and take it over.
Masisho Kiinalik for that wonderful introduction and acknowledgement. Uvlami, Tira Reneltta Arluk. I'm originally from the Northwest Territories. My mother is Danes Luslene and Cree from the Fort Chippewa Fort Smith region. And my father is the Nuvialamit Gujen from the Inuvik region. I would like to just have a little statement here. Until recently, consent was not a practice held by mainstream society. Mainstream meaning those in positions of power, of race, gender, and status privilege. Consent, however, is now being brought front and center to challenge the norm. This is happening with the hashtag #MeToo movement, hashtag Nothing About Us Without Us, hashtag Su-Feh, hashtag Black Lives Matter. Consent asks for us to be accountable to our actions. Importantly, it creates space for all voices to be heard. It's an exciting time to be an artist. It's an exciting time to be in the arts, navigating these various protocols and ethics. So I'm excited to be here and to hear from the team of amazing panelists that are gathered. And if we could start out by introducing ourselves. So we'll start with you, Victoria. Masi.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yeah. Tēnā koutou. Ko Tarawera te manga, that's Tarawera is my mountain. Ko Tarawera te awa, that's our rivers, our lake. Ko Te Arawa te iwi, the tribe that I am affiliated with. Ko Ngāti Hinemihi te hapu is the sub-tribe. Ko Hinemihi te whare tupuna is my ancestral meeting house. Ko Wikitoria aho. I was born on the land of the Yugambeh people as part of Bundjalung Nation at the Gold Coast in Australia. And I live on the land of the Gadigal people in Sydney. And I'm looking forward to this discussion.
My name is Evalyn Parry. I am a co-creator and performer in Kiinalik, These Sharp Tools, performance here at the PuSh Festival. And I'm the artistic director of Buddies in Bad Times Theatre in Toronto, which is a queer theatre company now in our 40th season with a venue in downtown Toronto.
Uanga Laakkuluk, Williamson Bath mea tsakapunga, ikalum miuunga, kalaliullungalo. Pingasun nikitom nakapunga, igimang me akutam me amanaya mea tsakatut. My name is Laakkuluk Williamson Bathory. I am a Greenlandic Inuit living in Inuit. I have 3 children named Akutak Igima Anaya. And I'm the artistic director of Kagyavut, a non-profit society that represents Nunavut Inuit performing artists in Nunavut, and we are creating theater while advocating for a performing arts center in Nunavut.
I'm Su-Feh, Lee Su-Feh. Lee is my family name, Su-Feh is my given name. Actually, before I continue, Jean? These lights are really violent. Could you turn them down a little? No, not possible. Okay, I'll deal with it. I'm the artistic director of Bathory Opera Performance. I'm a choreographer, a performer. I also teach voice and movement. I teach voice and movement here in this institution. I'm a sessional in the theater area. I live here now in Vancouver on unceded Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh territory, but I'm from Malaysia originally, although my ancestors come from the Fujian province in China. I like to say that I come from lineage of sailors and whores. I feel like I'm highly aware that for some people I look like the face of aggressors or I represent colonizing sometimes. And I'm also acutely aware that historically, being a Chinese body, I have ancestors who have, and I have experienced discrimination or things taken away from me. So this sort of Venn diagram of my body is where I operate from. This awareness of being both tyrant and victim.
So we'll jump in with some questions so we can hear. Laakkuluk and Evalyn, seeing Kiinalik was a feast of goodness, a visual conversation with a great score. I felt like I was coming home, and I really needed that, so I was really grateful. We do such barrier-breaking work as artists, and this felt like the barrier was down, and some honest sharing was had. And it was generous to have been invited to not only witness, but participate in that conversation. So I just wanted to ask, how did you go about the creation of this work in the way that you did? I feel like it was a process that I'd like to hear a bit more about. And has that impacted your creative process since?
I think there's all sorts of, as we were saying yesterday actually in the talk back, there's all sorts of very different moments of creation and collaboration that happen out of a linear time sequence. In terms of what artists came to be with which ones and who said what and all those kind of things. The main idea that has propelled Kiinalik is that we've had very difficult conversations conversations that took us a long time to think through, to find the right words to describe what we were feeling. And conversations that went on and on, even though we had a very tight deadline of coming up with a show. These conversations just kept on propelling us. And also insisting on being on the land by going to my family cabin, by being very cold on the sea ice, and cooking and eating in a place that has no electricity, no Wi-Fi, no running water. It's all frozen water. Yeah, that was, I think, very integral to how we were able to create this.
It was a very collaborative process that involved a number of other artists beside the two of us, although we're sort of the face of the project. The contribution of the thinking and energy and navigation of trying to, it feels like the piece is in conversation with itself in a way, like the making of the piece is brought into the show itself, and as we've wrestled with the constructs that we work inside as artists, inside this colonial framework of theater, and trying to combine, both of us come from distinct artistic practices that actually exist outside of those frameworks of theater. And so trying to bring those together and put them side by side as we're putting our lives, sort of weaving very personal stories of our lives together with these larger political stories that we're interested to tell and that feel so important to unpack at this time. So yeah, it was such a, the process so reflected the themes, I would say, very deeply. And Laakkuluk's, I want to acknowledge Laakkuluk's immense generosity in hosting us in her territory and homeland, and introducing us, allowing us to be guests and be so welcomed, and insisting that the project, that we had to be on the land in order to take the next step, to take the project forward, was integral for all of us. And I don't think we knew that until we experienced being on the land and an extended period of work in Nunavut. And it's very much a work that is like we think of it as a conversation that's continuing to evolve. So we've made changes here in Vancouver. We made changes when we arrived in Iqaluit in December to work on the piece again. It's going to continue. Every place that we are, it's impacted by place and also by where we are now. So those are a few thoughts.
And bringing that into the structure of a theater, the elements that you were able to sustain, which is the ice that's in the front, the use of the imagery, which is, the use, video of your family, and that it, again, invites the audience to witness that in a very specific, intimate way. And generosity comes from a place of knowing, and knowing the generosity. So just really grateful. We'll move on to... You can take more time to answer. I only have like 4 questions, so don't worry. We're not going to run out of time. Su-Feh, on your website, because we haven't met before, so I had to Google you. On your website, you wrote, "Contemporary practice for me is a constant negotiation between function and action. And I seek dance that is action, not representation." And you've also said that language is fluid. In the pieces that I've read about and seen, there is a fluidity to your work that does show that action. So how do you engage in your practice to define the structure you work within rather than having it define you? And I kind of referenced like the dance machine, the work that you were doing with that. Big question.
What was that last bit about structure?
Yeah, let's go there. I said that how do you engage in your practice to define the structure you work within rather than have it define you?
Oh. Well, I think I think the dance machine, let's start, the dance machine and another piece I've done, everything, sort of performance generating systems. And so I guess I've made a structure, and then I assume that the structure will affect me and transform me. And the consent piece here is, so in the dance machine, there was this long process that led to the creation of an installation. And then the second part was inviting people in to engage with this installation. And in that process, a lot of questions about, because any kind of environment will affect you. And so this question, and then I was really aware that, oh, I've made an environment that is in some way a representation of my body and all its concerns. And how do I invite people into that body, but also allow them to say no to certain things so that I'm not imposing myself on them? How do I invite them into me? An invitation always means that people have the right to say no. And if they say no, how can they still be with me? I guess that's this whole consent thing and ethics. For me, the thing that I'm most curious about is how can you say no to something and still be with the person you're saying no to? Because I feel like most of the time we have, well, we're socialized around no's, well, to respond to no's through exile. Your kid says no and you send them to their room. You say no, I can't love you if you say no. You're not my friend if you say no to me. If you say no to this bit of food, you're saying no to the whole meal or to being with me. And that just seems really reductive. One of the other things I do, other than being a choreographer and teacher, is I'm quite active in the BDSM scene. And one of the big lessons in kink is negotiation, so that you know, two people can negotiate before they play. And in the negotiation, the no becomes extremely useful, because when someone says, "I'll do anything you want," if I'm the top, it's really oppressive, because then, what do you mean everything? This chainsaw at you? And so when the no comes, it becomes an invitation to the specificity of the intimacy between two people. And so I'm very curious about how to invite no as a transformative and transformative, and that's what's the word? A thing that opens up new things rather than closes down relationships. And that is true whether you're fucking or whether you're making art or teaching. Because I'm doing a lot of teaching now. I'm really exploring what does it mean for my students to say no to certain things, and can I really accept a no? Or will I respond to the no with my own feelings and history of abandonment issues or whatever, you know? Or, so these are the things I think about. I don't know if I answered your question.
I've learned now that at Banff Central, I've learned this wonderful term called enabling constraints, which is when you hear no, how do you still accomplish what you want to accomplish? So enabling constraints. We'll jump over to you, Victoria. Victoria, with Copper Promises, it was a connection to ancestor that was the focus, I felt, the focus of your piece, yes? Yes. Oh, great. And, and it was deeply engaging work. And I'm familiar with Muslim Bone just because of Charles and Patty, mutual friends. And so, and the process was the deep process of exploration, and it was powerful. So what were some of the ways that this exploration was fully supported by community? What were some of the challenge of that? To be able to dig into that deep work, I feel like you can't do that by yourself. Like, it's really hard to do. So I was curious to know how you went about that process.
Thank you. Yes, exactly. And supported so far back as well. I think, to be honest, what led me to this point now is being guided by an ancestral presence. And even in the troubling space of being born on other people's tangata whenua, on other people's land, the sense of being held has always been there. My parents separated when I was 2, so my mother's English, Irish and Finnish, and my father is Te Arawa, Ngāti Kahungunu and Rongwhakata Māori. And the intensity of that connection to my Māori ancestry was a gradual kind of unfolding as I got older and older. Various things happened, which I won't go into detail, but that presence became more and more evident. And it eventually led me to seek out the whereabouts of my father. And I had a sense that it wouldn't be a happy story. I sort of had a sense that he would be possibly incarcerated or no longer in this world. So I wrote to all the hunts in the that I could find through directory at the time and back in Rotorua, and I got 14 letters back. All the letters came back saying, "We don't know, we're not part of your family, but good luck. We think we might know who your aunties and uncles are," etc., etc. Until eventually, my auntie and uncle wrote back. And we had this exchange saying that they'd always known that I'd existed but had no way to contact me, and that my father had passed away. But the circumstances around his passing were too complex to communicate, so they invited me back to Rotorua. And that's the first time I met them, apart from all the tears, was they handed me the coroner's report, and my instinct, he was picked up for drinking in a park in Bundaberg, which in the 90s was a very violent, racist police state. And he was picked up as a black fella drinking in a park and given the option, as if it's a choice, to spend 3 nights in the watch house or pay a $130 fine. So he opted to pay the fine, to do the time. And due to a number of circumstances, he ended up dying in the watch house. He had a seizure, he was taken to the hospital. The doctor that assessed him, according to this report and other conversations, assessed him for about 15 minutes. He was an alcoholic and was not well. And basically it was, he's a dying man. He's an islander fella. There's nothing we can do. And they sent him back to prison. And then there was no intercom. There was all sorts of system failures that happened. So my contact with my family also carried this sadness about not being able to do anything from where they were. And so I also inherited a responsibility to follow this up. And many things started to kind of make sense. And also as a dancer, as a performer, I could feel things coming out of my body. And so I had to dance my father's incarceration in a work that also then opened up more questions for me. So then I started this journey of going backwards and forwards and reconnecting. He was the youngest of 17 kids. My Auntie Hine has 22 kids, Uncle Humana 14, Uncle Jack 9. I've got 76 first cousins, so it was a huge family to connect back into. So all of that is really, really important. And my uncle started to take me out to our ancestral, where Tarawera was. My uncle tried to take me up to and just things that really strike so deeply, which is him trying to explain that this empty grove is where our ancestral meeting house, Hinemihi, should have been, and he should be able to introduce me to her. But after the eruption, she was acquired by the Governor-General of New Zealand and taken as a memento and placed in his garden in Surrey, England. And so also the tears that he was feeling and shared with me, and there was also a connection to her alienation and dislocation that I was feeling as well, coming to terms with being born on the beautiful privilege of being born on the land of the Yugambeh people. So this all, I feel like at that point my spirit and Hinemihi's spirit really joined in some way. And so I dedicated time to understanding this more and more. And after 10 years, that's when this work, Copper Promises, was ready to had the support that it needed, had the mentorship and the guidance, had the conversations in terms of the protocols, understanding the colonial context of placing a work in the theatre. I really wanted to put this work in this context. I don't know whether you wanted to kind of shift it into a ceremonial space that needed to have a lot of consultation around how to do that and understanding. So I had to be really ready, and I wasn't in a hurry. So Hinemihi is an ancestral meeting house. It's also my grandmother. Myself, amongst many, are the descendants of her, and so we all inherit the role as guardians or protectors. And so for as long as she's in the UK, other parts of her are in Paris and other places, and as long as that is happening, it's our duty and responsibility to keep her warm and to let her know that we love her and she's not forgotten.
That was wonderful, thank you. When we think about our ancestors or going deep into our own practice, I always think that language is a huge part of that, because language has carries identity, carries place, carries environment, and as a teacher, my mother is a residential school survivor, and my father also was taken by addiction, and so, but we still carry that knowledge, and then we carry that trauma that comes from that disconnection. And it takes a lot of work to be able to dig back into it and kind of go past that into the deeper ground of learning. And so, do a segue. So when we dig into language, something that I'm appreciative of and grateful for is hearing it, and hearing the Inuktitut used in your show in Kiinalik is so powerful, and I feel like it's beautifully unapologetic, and that it also is again inviting. So I know that language is very much a part of your life, but how do you when you engage Inuktitut into your performance? What is the perspective that you have on that? And you can speak on Kiviuk returns as well.
Just joking. Yeah, language is very, very important. And I'm in a very special position, having been born in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and speaking my language with my mother. as an Inuit family in the 1980s in the middle of the prairies. And this is in the face of tremendous language loss all across Canada. And it's still continuing. In Iqaluit, where my family is based, there are no two children that will play in the playground speaking Inuktitut to one another. And I know exactly how possible it is to keep a language alive, because I speak the language that my mother taught me to my children as well. And all of these connections to ancestors, to ancestral homes, to the practices, to points of land, to the taste of things, is all captured within the language. And to think of all these little tremendous things that were taken away from your mother in residential school, that were taken away from my mother in residential school too, is overwhelming at times. But then I have it within the capacity within myself to keep saying these words and growing them so that not just myself and my children, but everybody around me can come to understand the concepts that are within these words.
I really liked the response you had for Kelly at the Globe and Mail on Twitter when he gave the review of Kiviuk, and that you were like, actually, the language. Do you want to give a little bit of insight on that? So
Kiviuk Returns is a play that I've been directing, and it just finished a run at Tarragon Theatre in Toronto, and it is 100% in Inuktitut. There's not a word of English in it. And there was 28 shows, 200 people every night watching it. And so what we did was, at first they wanted to have surtitles going above people's heads. And I thought, wow, we have the stories of elders captured in video, and the actors stop what they're doing to pay attention to what the elders are saying in Inuktitut. I thought, with the surtitles, nobody's going to be paying that respect. They're just going to be wanting to absorb all that information in a different language. So I said, no surtitles. And then they said, what are you going to do then? And we made the choice as a group together that people need to be washed in the language of Inuit. Just let those words tumble around in your ears so that you can hear the specific sounds, like you were doing earlier. How do you make that ka sound? Listen to it over and over again, and to see how people's emotions are different. What kind of sorrow, what kind of happiness, what kind of joy comes through the spaces between your teeth in that language. Yeah. And so we made a bit of a compromise where we'd bring the house lights up just a little bit from time to time, so people could read the stories that were in English in the program, and that was our only concession. And we gave that as a gift to the audience. It wasn't a right that they had. So, what's his name in the Globe and Mail said that he really felt that he needed to have the surtitles, and I said in not a direct response to him, but in our community, I said that now he knows. Now he knows what it's like to be an elder in her own homeland, being completely overwhelmed with English and not understanding what's happening in her own home. Now he knows.
It's so important to have that occasion inside of Kiviuk and also inside Kiinalik for Canadians to hear a language that is a language indigenous to our land, and to experience it without mediation in some way. Like,
when we think about responsibility, all of us are artists. All of us are here in positions of power as artistic directors, choreographers, creators. All of us make decisions that ask us to be accountable to our community, whether that be our community of theater, dance, gender, race, and abilities. And the beautiful part of being an artist is that you can create the work that aligns with your vision. Where it gets complex is when we are being asked to bring our art into spaces that create differently and are often institutional, or are bringing work into our space that is being held, or asking people to come into space that's being held by us. So that it's cyclical, like we come into places that are institutional, and then sometimes we welcome people into our space. So can you speak, each of you, a bit on how it has been to navigate these complex yet vital waters on both sides? And what keeps your light burning, why we keep doing it, and what do you hope will change or align? Big questions.
Yeah, I've been experiencing working in an institution. It's funny because I actually never went through an institution in my training. So I really felt the logic of or the illogic of the institution. Like, you know, it's unclear to me how things are laid out, but it's very clear to someone who's been through the institution. So, you know, like going onto the SFU website, it's impossible. But my partner, who has been to university, like understands how it works instantly. And I'm really aware of how much that can affect my body. Already this morning, I'm giving him a text. I'm going, I'll see you at the SEA. And he goes, what's the SEA? I'm like, oh, fuck. I've turned into like an institutionalized person. I'm assuming that everybody knows what acronyms mean, you know? Because when I come here, people go, you know, are you teaching CA 255 or 252? I'm like, what the fuck does that mean? I'm teaching voice and movement. But I'm starting to think like that, like these codes that really close in and don't open out to people who don't know the code. So it's a kind of closing in. So it's a struggle in oneself to continually try to listen deeply to, because what you just described there of the invitation to listen deeply, so you can listen to the sounds of the spaces in one's vocal tract instead of relying on this 2D visual understanding of how things are going. How do we learn other ways of being with others? I don't really have a clear strategy other than, you know, Joe Osawabine of the Bajamujig, a few years ago at Talking Stick Festival, he said something about he's trying to replace the word professional with honorable. And so I carry that with me. Like, what does it mean to be an honorable artist? What does it mean to be an honorable teacher? What does it mean to be an honorable partner instead of a professional? So maybe that's one strategy I'm sharing.
And the beautiful thing about Dabaj is that when they host you, they host all of you. They host you food, they host you space, they host you knowledge keepers. We did the repast there with the NAC, and it was incredible how greatly honorable they were to us as guests. And then we were a lot of us. Mm-hmm. So when you think about a decolonization of space, it isn't just a structure that gives you some lights and some sound. It's actually, but let us feed you, let us house you, let us make sure that you are supported emotionally as well. Vital.
One thing that you and I have talked about actually is how institutions in the Arctic physically float above the land. They are not rooted on the land. And that's because housing has to be, you can't have basements in the Arctic because if you're introducing heat into the permafrost. And once you do that, everything slides and crumbles. So all the houses are on these very long metal stilts. So institutions literally float above the land. The justice system, the education system, the healthcare system, the government floats above the land. And everything that we do as family and as people speaking language and reclaiming language is actually being on the land and being in the water and eating from the land and drinking from the water. And I really find that it's my place to point these things out. I kind of lost track of the question, but...
So that's part of the conversation and part of the question. It's the navigation of how do we... I'll have to look at my question now. What did I say? The responsibility. So when it gets complex, we are being asked to bring our art into spaces. So can you speak a bit on how it has been to navigate these complex yet vital waters on both sides? So I guess looking at how you're creating how Kagyuvut is creating art in spaces that have yet to find a home, and how it has been to navigate that, and also what can we do to help?
Money? Yeah, I was mentioning we don't have a performing arts center in Nunavut. And so when we've been creating Kiinalik, it's this mind-blowing thing where it's Inuit theater using Inuktitut, working with Buddies in Bad Times, working with Evalyn and our whole team. We rent from the Francophone Center. There's a Francophone Center in Nakaluyid. There is a French school in Nakaluyid. There is no Inuit Center. There's no Inuktitut school. So that's mostly the spaces that we used. And then we performed in a hotel conference room named after Sir Martin Frobisher, who got lost in the area 500 years ago. And for Kiviok Returns, we rehearsed in the soup kitchen, where they feed 200 people a day. And it's the food service comes in and out of this space, and it's a very bustling environment. And then by 1:30 in the afternoon, everything's cleared out, and we make sure that all our spike marks are on the floor are still there. And it was a fascinating thing that happened in September when we were rehearsing for Kiviok is that, I mean, the stage area took up the whole soup kitchen. And as a director, I stood in the kitchen to direct while they were on the floor. And there wasn't any room to do any projections. There was no lighting, nothing even like this. So all the actors just imagined what the projections were, what the light would be like. And the lighting director, the lighting designer, and the video designer gave prompts in words as to what it was going to be like. So after we finished rehearsing, we took a little airplane and flew right over to Greenland. It's only an hour flight. And went into the theater, the National Theater of Greenland, and loaded the show in and hung the lights and focused them and put together the props. And then invited all the actors in, and they were like, oh, like actually touching the projections. Oh, and I mean, we do this in these spaces that have nothing for us, and yet the Minister of Indigenous Affairs comes to our play, and all these people come to see what we're doing. Not that that was a pinnacle, but.
But what can we do? What can we do to help?
So we really do need to build a space that can contain our language, that can contain our ideas. We've been told by many elders who are the people who are born and brought up on the land, the people that gave birth on the land, that moved into communities, forcibly moved into towns and cities as adults, some of them as grandchildren. These are very old people that are starting to die now. They said that the only institution that they feel safe in to pass down stories and histories and language is through the performing arts. And so if you go to kagiavut.com, it's not that hard to spell. You can find out more.
It's Q-A-G-G-I-U-T. No.
Almost.
Q-A-G-G-I-A-V-U-U-T.
Yeah, QAGGIAVUUT.com. And yeah, I mean, I'm actually saying if the ways that people can help is by supporting what we do on our own terms. And if you would like to donate, that's amazing. That's right.
Yay, I'm going to do it later today.
Can I ask for clarification? So in your experience, was the experience of rehearsing in the kitchen a good experience for you?
It was a good experience to actually be able to work in our community as honorable artists, to be able to show our children, because if we're strictly working in the theater world, we're always traveling away from home. So our kids don't see what we do. And you know how kids always follow what their parents do and understand their parents' professions pretty well. But as artists, we don't get that chance in the Raduit. So that was a really wonderful thing. And to be able to eat our food, frozen fish and seal meat and whale meat and all that kind of stuff on a daily basis completely fed our souls in order to be able to do this work. But it was very stressful. Yeah.
So I'm just curious, how would you imagine, like if you had money and you could build space that held you, how would this not become, like, I'm searching for words, how would you take care that it doesn't become an institution that floats on top of the water?
Yeah, I think that is such a very important question, and we are in danger of it because of everything being so colonized, all institutions being so colonized. And we're actually in a very long-drawn dispute with the government of Nunavut about who gets to run this place. Is it a governmental institution or is it run by Inuit artists? And why isn't it? Why aren't you allowing Inuit artists to run it? Why does the government wants to be all over it, and instead of supporting something that's coming from the community? So I think that the most important thing is to continue to support and cultivate young Inuit to use their language and to trust their creativity. And as we say in the play, to be themselves, to create what they need to create, not as a pantomime, not as a cultural representation, but as themselves.
Do you want to jump in, Evalyn?
Yeah, maybe the spaces come from the spaces in your body.
That's right, yeah.
I want to reflect on the question from a few different perspectives, but one that I spend a lot of time thinking about and have done over the last 3.5 years since I've been the artistic director of Buddies has been what it is to run a building, to have a theater space, and as a queer company that started in 1979, we've been in the building that we're in for almost 25 years. And it's, for those of you who haven't ever been there before, it's a pretty large, we have a large main space that's a flexible black box, and we have a cabaret space. And there's lots I could say about the building, but the thing that has really struck me since occupying this new role, I've been involved at Buddies for a long time as an artist, as an audience member, running emerging artist programming and stuff. But taking the reins was a sudden, first of all, immersion into the budget and the realities of what it means to resource a building, and how many resources and what percentage of our budget goes to making this space, keeping the heat and the lights, and making it run, and then thinking about what a resource that has been to the queer community, the theater community at large, but specifically the queer community in Toronto for 25 years, that we've had this relatively immense space. Most alternative companies, this is like a company that started in a very with a very politicized mandate, and also not only around queer activism, but also around formal queerness, investigating alternative theater in many iterations. And what it is to not be in a storefront or a little, backspace kind of a venue, but to have this real venue. And what I believe part of the impact of that venue, where, like our main space is larger than this room by another third, probably, and to have a space that's large enough to have a perspective on your own work, to be able to step back from it, not to be pressed up against or working in tight constraints, is like an incredible gift. And that I think that's had an enormous impact on our queer artists in Toronto, to have access to a space like that where you can, there's spaciousness around, and the possibilities for the imagination to really expand and to use a space in different ways and imaginative ways. So I've thought about that a lot, and then, even inside this panel today, I'm thinking about the fact that I didn't introduce myself to begin with anything really about my own heritage. And I realized at the end of everybody introducing themselves that I think it's one of the ways, as white folk, we often don't see we see ourselves as the standard or the neutral. And so I want to backtrack a moment in non-linear time here and take a moment to acknowledge myself as a first-generation Canadian, that my parents were immigrants to Victoria, BC first. My mom's from the United States, from the East Coast in Pennsylvania, and my dad's from Britain, with Scottish heritage before that. And I grew up in downtown Toronto, so Toronto is very much feels like my home. But this act of starting to unpack and understand the neutrality of whiteness, or the assumed neutrality of whiteness, and what it means to be a white queer woman in a position of artistic directorship in Toronto. I'm the only other, there's two of us. Nina Aquino is the other female artistic director, a woman of color, amazing artist who runs the Factory Theatre. And me, we are the only two women that run venues in Toronto. And what it is to navigate the power of having a space, and the power of the mantle of artistic directorship, and all the ways that has challenged and unsettled me, and been an that it's this incredible opportunity, and also all these constraints of the ways things are done, the institution that you step into, the CTA, the Canadian Theatre Agreement, and the Actors' Equity, and these structures that I actually, until taking this role, I'm not an equity member, spent my career making theatre outside of the sort of requirements of, because I've always been a bit of a rebellious artist who wanted to work in other forms and wanted to take time. I think that's the defining feature, actually, that where equity has been really difficult for me as an artist in the collectives, because I've mostly worked in very collaborative formats where our work takes years, and we make it ourselves and we perform it ourselves, and the rules that have reigned over the way that we make theater had never applied, never worked for us. It just meant needless paperwork that didn't serve anything about the way that we were doing things. So now bringing that perspective into a leadership role and trying to work with other companies, and at Buddies, our space, we produce a little bit of work in our space, but we also co-produce and act as a host venue to a lot of other companies. So part of the big work, and I feel it's only beginning, is to figure out how to really make our space welcoming to other companies who are working in different ways, and artists, especially artists of different intersectional queer identities who are working with multiple barriers to access, and how to be open to changing the structures of how things are done. So, I mean, I could get into it, but I think that's just a thing that I'm really grappling with and feels like it's challenging and exciting, and I am continually being challenged by young artists who are demanding more and seeing, you know, the flaws and questioning why things are done the way they're done, and that's really exciting to be challenged and unsettling to everybody and destabilizing to institutions that even when you're a queer institution that sort of prides yourself on being different and rebellious, I watch how over and over our whole staff is challenged by, you know, new ways of doing things and really not assuming that the way it's been is the way that it needs to continue, because we're obviously at a tipping point where things must change.
I was just thinking then about when approaching somebody, particularly within a cultural context where I come from, it's the questions that get asked immediately are, you know, where are you from? And what's your kaupapa? And the kaupapa is like the what's your purpose? Why are we together? And so when approaching, say, anybody, but maybe approaching an elder with some specific kind of question, then it can take years to actually prepare, to actually have that conversation with them. It's, you know, there's a lot of negotiation around all of that in terms of what that preparation requires. However, the journey of that is the preparation for coming into the theatre, I think, or coming into these institutions with the kaupapa that's a collective kaupapa. Like, it's not me deciding necessarily when I'm with this work particularly. I'm bringing with it a lot of people who are in my ear, who I've been in conversation with, that about negotiating the space and being able to sometimes challenge those spaces as well, but in a way that suits our kaupapa, which is about, you know, how we there's certain ways of being hosted that we need to also reciprocate as well as being hosted. I just went around in circles and I'm trying to sort of work this out, but for me it's also quite, there's a lot of very subtle but very, very big aspects to how to prepare the way to bring to bring ceremony into theatre, for instance. An example recently is having set the space, and it's just a misunderstanding, but a big tray of food came into the theatre with all good intentions to feed the crew. But in terms of what I've been taught in terms of how to prepare, there's a certain point where food, you know, needs to not come into the space. It's in terms of what is tapu and what is noa. So food is something that we do after. And that's a very difficult disruption that seems so, it's just a misunderstanding. But I find that these misunderstandings, you can prepare as much as you can, but then something comes and it's not expected, and so that's why I also need a lot of support around me to be able to access and contact people so that I can be in dialogue when things like this happen, so I can just be reassured that it's actually fine. It's actually okay.
Could I respond to that just around the idea of time and the time that it takes to establish relationships, especially when working cross-culturally? And what, I mean, I feel like that's been very true inside of the process of Kiinalik, and it's also when I think it's a piece of this institutional resistance or like efficiency, colonial efficiencies, that it's hard to build in like the budget or to change, to shift your economic framework to take the time that's necessary to do the actual deeper work. And one of the neat things that we've been able to do with some support inside of the process of Kiinalik is to introduce a mentorship where when the whole team, which is mostly a Southern team, came up to Inuit to work, we mentored, while we were doing the rehearsal process, we worked with a bunch of local emerging Inuit artists who are working with Kaagivut. And so we had a chance to like do knowledge sharing and skill building in some areas that Laakkuluk had identified the community could really use some more people who had more technical skills and stage management and design. And so all of our production team came to help do that. And it was awesome. And the end result, like it made our rehearsal process a lot less efficient in a certain way because it took longer. It wasn't as straightforward as just us rehearsing the show. And so we had to make more time and make a looser kind of time, especially than we Southern Toronto people are like super uptight with our schedules. It's challenged to work on Northern time and in a different kind of frame.
So much fun teasing all the Torontonians. 23 hours and 56 minutes until call time.
But I think the end result of that really important work and amazing vision that, the project that was envisioned has been the building of relationships in real time, and that those that's like the basis of our play. Our show is about relationship building between the two of us, between our whole team, and now it's extended to another circle of younger emerging artists. But it's literally about putting in a kind of time that can't be, it's hard to pay for and quantify, and but it's about relationship building, actual people relationship building.
Yeah. Yeah, and so we named this mentorship program, we're Team Kiinalik from the play, and then there was Team Nukilik, which means, and those were the people in the mentorship program. Nukilik means the ones that have strength. And there was actually, what I really love to emphasize in our processes in Iqaluit and Nunavut is that learning happens on an equal basis. You come in as both a teacher and a learner. You come in both as a learner and a teacher. And I found it very interesting that Team Kiinalik understood that leadership comes in different ways from Team Nukilik. Like when we went to go collect the ice for the show, it was no longer the production manager that was in charge. It was a 23-year-old guy that hunts and knows ice. Mm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's interesting to talk about time in this conversation around ethics and consent, because I think often we think about, when we talk about theater or just consent, we're talking about spaces, the spaces in my body, or this room that we're in, or the theater or the studio. But time is a huge component in our body, in our understanding of where we are, and so that's what I'm reflecting on. And I think the piece about the movement with institutions is this word efficiency comes into play. and I think it's always more efficient when we connect with, you know, humans, and then we can, but but that's also that desire for efficiency, and which is also about self-preservation, also contributes to systems replicating themselves, because then in the end it's us working amongst people, and we don't hold the institution accountable. And so how do we make actions or embed actions in our decision making in the process, so that there is some that the institutions can be unsettled in some way. That's the question. So for example, with the dance machine, one of the protocols of the dance machine as we move from one place to another is we spend maybe a day or two meeting with an elder or a representative of a host nation where we're on. And I try and get the institution to do that, because it's an invitation for the institution to do some work around that. And each institution will respond in a different way, and with different kinds of failures or successes. And sometimes I'm struck with, oh, it would have been so much more efficient if I had just gone through my channels. But sometimes I think about the ethics of that too. Should I have gone through my own channels? And that's more, you know, about relationship build. Is that more honorable? So there's always a question.
It's a form of accountability, which is really important, and that should be part of the conversation. I mean, we all have access to our communities, and so, but how do we invite our community and create a safe space for them? I got a call I got a call from a really wonderful woman who asked me if we were going to be talking about disability arts. And I looked at our panelists and I thought, you know, I'm going to be honest, I don't think we are, because I don't feel comfortable speaking on it, and none of our panelists have that knowledge. So I asked to be sent some verbiage so I could share that, because I think that is a part of the voice that should be represented as well as part of this conversation. And so I'm hoping that a few people that shared this with me can speak about it maybe in our Q&A at the end of the session. But what I was sent by JD was, Canada Council has written this about deaf and disability arts. For the Canada Council, deaf and disability arts are diverse artistic practice in which being deaf, having a disability, or living with mental illness are central to the exploration of narrative and/or aesthetics. And because there's a lot of what we take from our living experiences and want to make the story we want to tell, what we are really trying to say is that all contributors are creators and are to be treated with equity in all ways. The focus is in developing artists not in integrated positions with disabilities into systems and processes that already exist, which is still a popular model. That consent has been severely overlooked and taken for granted. And I think that what we are talking about here with consent and ethics is breaking down that model so that it concludes practice that is coming from the people who are creating the work that wants to be shared and asked to be shared. So with that, I'm going to open up with some Q&A for the last remaining minutes that we have.
Thank you very much. I was wondering, for the we talked a lot about the relationship of the artist and the institution. Is there any room to discuss a little bit about the relationship between the artist and the audience, and how do we navigate how much we push or pull? Because one way is to take care, ultimate care, but are there ways that the artists will actually express themselves and push? And that care looks like in different colors and all that. So I'm wondering, how do you navigate? What are the tools that you test? So one of the examples was using another language, like not the language of the majority of the audience. How much do you push? How do you navigate? Because may I just add, because a lot of the times we talk about ethics in the light of taking care of the audience, sometimes reminds me of education, but I'm wondering if there's any room for expression that is not fully educating the audience.
My artistic practice is based on Williamson, which is a very close and direct interaction with audience members. So that it's actually, I'm only half of the performance. The audience member is doing the other half. And it's very provocative, and its whole purpose is to stretch the boundaries of comfort. And that is educational in some ways, but it's also a very visceral experience. And in terms of it being visceral, it's all about sex. It's about the induction of fear, and it's about where your sense of humor remains.
I guess the question is what you mean by taking care. If taking care is to make sure everyone's comfortable, then I'm not interested in taking care. But if taking care means I care enough that you get through this experience without being damaged somehow, and that we will go through an experience together, and maybe by the end of it, there's a possibility that there is going to be more intimacy between us as honorable people, then yes, I'll take care of you.
And for me, I understand that as a conduit, or as a, like, I am bringing my ancestors. I've asked for permission for a temporal transference of the lands that I'm on to dance, and I also, as I am holding space and activating this space, I'm very much in. I feel like I'm also acknowledging the ancestors, like all of you here as well, that you come. So we're sharing heat, we're sharing breath, we're sharing this space together right now, but also as much as my ancestors are here, so are yours. And so I feel like there's a conversation that is also happening between us on that level. And that's like a prayer, it's like a karakia for a period of time that we're together. And so how that space is opened and also how it closes is something that I take care of.
Other questions?
Thank you. My name is Joan, and my son Niall is an artist who has Down syndrome, and he's 37 years old. And there were a couple of things that came up in the talk today that just, I feel, really resonated around things that Niall is speaking about to me these days. And some of what you said helped me to understand it. So I'd just like to say that back and see what comes. The first was about the codes that close in and don't open up for people who do not understand, and that we need to listen deeply to the sounds of the person's voice in their vocal tract. Niall has been saying lately, people don't understand my voice. They don't understand what I'm talking about. And following up around that is this, Niall says too that he needs a lot of support around him so that he can be reassured. So people will understand what he's trying to talk about, and if they don't, that he'll have some support around him. So thank you for bringing those teachings up. If there's anything else that comes up in response, I'd be interested to hear. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that.
I also think it's something in our, as being humans in these current times, that to resist fixing ourselves, and how to be able to move and shift positionality. And so, you know, in that relational space, it's so important to be able to do that in order to receive and give.
Hello, thank you. I'm Holly Bright. I live in a small city in Nanaimo-on Nanaimo territory, and I present dance. I feel that in some way this brought to mind that my role as a presenter is a caretaking role in a way, in that I care for the artists and how their work is presented, and I also require to develop trust with my audience so that they have consent when they walk into the studio, into the theater. They know what they're walking into, and so there's a way that I balance what I tell them around the show, and so I really rely on the artists to actually try to use their words, and then I also require to ask things like, well, is there nudity, is there swearing, because we have 3 honorable and professional performing dance artists in our community, and probably about 1,500 dance students who are younger. So there's this interesting balance that I walk. So I guess I think about that, and with respect to relationships and institutions and people, and it's not really a fully formed question or anything, but just to say that I work a lot with the Nanaimo people, and I'm fascinated by the relationship of the language, the people, and the land, and how the land unfolds in the way that it does, in its patience and its own time. And the language, in order to speak it properly, one must speak slowly. And that really reflects my relationship with the Nanaimo people. And what it's done for my life is to really shakes my head a little bit, and has assisted me to look at my relationships with people and to listen to them, listen to the tone and timbre of their voice. I've become really fascinated by how our language actually supports the way we communicate with each other. It defines us almost. And so somehow for me, that within the context of this conversation, I'm exploring how relationship is really challenging within the constraints of institution, and yet we are the institution. Like, it really, I'm curious, what is the distinction between institution and people, and my $300,000 annual budget versus a $5 million annual budget institution, or a dance company, or a training system of some sort. You know, like, for me, it's becoming more and more clear that it's really about people, and it's about those relationships and developing them that might create change, and also is new and different, and it has its challenges in terms of efficiency and budget, while also being completely fulfilling and unsettling.
I feel prompted to talk about the language acknowledgement that we do before Give Your Return starts, the 100% Inuktitut play. And in that language acknowledgement, we say that everybody who's in this room has come into an agreement with one another. The audience agrees that they are listening to Inuktitut and acknowledging the place that this language has in its own land. And as performers, the cast and the crew and everybody else agrees that they will work as hard as they can to expand their use of the language. And for me, that's consent on both sides in regards to language.
Right, you introduce a new contract.
Are there other questions? Ariel, you already asked a question.
Thank you so much for the conversation. This notion of practice of culture, which we do, but then also the act of performing it to others who may not be from that culture. I'd just love to hear about your relationship in terms of educationally, why and how you undertake that, versus or in relationship to how it is a practice that needs no form of translation or interpretation. This fascinating idea that by performing it, you are also attempting to educate or to pass on knowledge to those who don't know it.
One of the privileges of being an artist, I think, is that we have the capacity to work across amazing tools that are actually communicating so much. So as the sort of body-based sort of component in an experience, but also working with the collaborators, we've all done a lot of research and experimentation at looking at the concepts, cultural concepts, and histories. My work is very much based on many series of ruptures and traumas. But how to mediate that history with an audience has required all of these different elements to communicate that in a way that doesn't alienate an audience as well, but also doesn't shy away from the distilled energetic experience of what is trying to be shared, and not be didactic. So yeah, myself and my team, rely very, very strongly on a space. We need to, if we're trying to bring an audience into and keep them into an experience to share for a moment some of these ruptures and traumas, but also keep them within that, then we're always at an edge in the space of break, and it's how far can we go before the space actually breaks, and that means everything. From the technology down to the experiences that we're holding. So, these concepts are really, they're big concepts of thresholds of passing between the living and the non-living and all sorts of things, and these dimensions that are attempting to be inviting people into an experience that does also come back to a resonance and a visceral empathy. It's a measure of tension. It's a measure of release. It's a measure of, it's pure energetics, in many ways as well. And, I could go on and on and on and on and on about what is actually involved in the crafting of this encounter and exchange. But yes. Does that answer?
I'm just thinking about how the embodiment, and as an artist, that being the embodiment of the personal as political, or the personal as a conduit to a wider kind of communication. And then I'm thinking about how, in a way, I believe something that threads my work together is what I need to learn is the project that I'm working on, or through the work I'm educating myself through my curiosities and following that, and then I'm thinking about dew line, the distant early warning system, the system of satellites that was set up across the American and Canadian northern, what's that? And Greenland, yes, during the Cold War, the system of communication that was supposed to alert America if there was going to be a nuclear attack from Russia. And this system, Marshall McLuhan has this wonderful quote about artists being the distant early warning system for the culture, telling the culture where they're going next. And that idea, I guess I'm just threading my own thought about like how personally I learn, and through the work, hopefully I'm transferring that knowledge in some way, and that artists as a whole, like all of the work that all of these folks and so many of the works at this festival, you know, are pushing the culture forward, or seeing the things that maybe, you know, like just guiding us toward new ways, new frameworks, new ways of seeing, whether it's overtly educational or if it's more, something more subtle. That's what I'm reflecting on from that question.
I agree with Evalyn entirely about artists as this distant early warning line. But I'd add to that it's also a challenge. We invite you to this challenge. And most people take us up on this challenge. Like, all right, if there was 100 people at the show yesterday, 99 did. And one person came up to the show yesterday afterwards and said, oh, it's absolutely fascinating, isn't it, how the Eskimo tribes speak the same language all across the Arctic.
Were you at the show?
Amazing.
He didn't take up that challenge, did he? Just casual racism.
I'm on this side of the room now. If somebody over here has a question.
Actually, can I?
Sorry.
Can I respond to that before we go to the next question? I'm not really sure if I'm interested in telling somebody about my culture or educating them. I think when I am in relationship with somebody, the audience say, then there's a culture at work or in that relationship. And I'm interested in how we can show up as fully as possible. And of course, it's much easier for someone who is in the dominant culture to show up fully, because the systems, the building, and the institutions around us support that person showing up fully. It's much harder for a marginalized person to show up fully, to be heard fully. So I'm trying to figure out how, when you make work, all sides can show up as fully as possible. And it feels like it has to do with maybe, you know, you come in here and already the rules of having to sit in a space, you know, you don't wander up here and sit here because you know the rules, you've learned that. Someone told you that at some point.
I wish the baby came here.
Yeah, but that rule isn't obvious, really. And in order for me to be in this space, I've left a whole bunch of other things that I've decided you're not ready to hear. So it feels like at the moment I'm interested in instructions, instructions as the choreographic tool. You know, instructions to the audience, instructions to the artist, and how clear those instructions can be. Is the piece a set of instructions? In the dance machine, in some ways, there was a set of instructions and that told you what to do with the actual dance machine or in the room, and then it was in that process that I hoped we would be able to negotiate how we can be together in that space.
And can I just say also, the inverse as well in terms of permission. In the space of the theatre as well, there are things that I can do and represent that is not really permissible. You know, like I can scream and bark like a wild dog at the economics, the vampiric economics that claims sacred objects and puts them in museums or collections or auctions at $3 million. We have to negotiate and talk very, very carefully out in the world of negotiations between trusts and all sorts of people, and do not mention the word repatriate at certain points in time in terms of the campaign. Revitalise, restore, we're up to return. The R words just keep getting on and on, but within this space, and that's what I invite to share, is a polemic outcry that comes up in this moment about how we actually, and pure energetic about how there's a dimension of feeling around that we also are gagged from communicating in its realness.
Oh, I hate to be the representative of time, given what we've talked about, but we did start a bit late, and I'm conscious that I've been favoring that side of the room. So if anybody over here has one last question, now's your chance. Going once?
Lunchtime.
Reneltta, do you want to conclude with a...
So thank you so much, Kiinalik Masicho, for taking the time to spend with us today. I'm very humbled and grateful to have shared this time with Su-Feh, Laakkuluk, Evalyn, and Victoria. And I hope, thank you to PuSh Festival for inviting me here and being able to see your incredible work. I'm so grateful. So have a good rest of your day and stay dry. Masicho.